lecture these theory questions, and how to develop the argument, if you like, and how to think about reading and in relation to the questions in hand. So that was the first log. It was much more, if you like, abstract in a sense. What I want to do in this log is to talk about how to actually put the essays together themselves, as in how to actually go about answering the specific questions. This is much more specific to the 7 questions on the course guide for this first term. Okay. Having said that, let me just tell you a couple of things I'm not going to do in this video log. If you've logged on and you want to find out the exact answers to any of these questions, I'm afraid I'm not going to give you those, nor am I going to give you what I would argue. I'm not also going to provide you with an individual personalized reading list. I'm afraid that the 27 pages or whatever it is in the course guide, that will have to suffice as a starting point. But hopefully some of the things that I say will make sense of specific readings to think about in relation to, and specific themes, I suppose, to think about in relation to each of the questions. Okay. What I would like to say to start with is remember the big puzzle that frames the course. Okay, and that big puzzle was, how do I say frame it in the first lecture? The kind of the big crisis, small change puzzle. In a sense, how do you think about the times we are living through, if you like? The idea that we're living through a crisis of almost unprecedented scale and scope, certainly in the modern era, and yet, and hopefully this second part of the argument is becoming clearer to you as well, so little has actually changed with the crisis. And that was the kind of puzzle that I set us at the beginning of the course. And as I said, both parts of this course, the first term that focuses on the theories and the abstract questions, and then the second term in 2014, which will focus on some specific case studies, but both of those are attempts to, they're building blocks, if you like, to, ways to think about that particular big crisis, small change puzzle. Okay, and I suppose the question that frames the first part of this course, the theory section, this term, is is IP, I suppose, complicit in this lack of change? Okay, and if you can have that, I suppose, the big overarching question, as in why has so little changed, and then the secondary question, what role has IPE itself and international theory, perhaps more generally, played in that lack of change? Those two overarching questions, I suppose, should frame the individual questions that you're answering. Okay, they're not distinct from. I suppose, in a sense, the individual 7 questions we're going to look at in a minute or two, they are constituent parts of that bigger overarching set of questions. Okay, so let's go through them. Let's draw a line under that for a second, and let's go through them for a minute or two. The first question then was, is the problem solving versus critical theory distinction a useful one? I mentioned in the lecture a couple of days ago that at some point in that, on answering that question, I would have thought you'd need to start with Robert Cox's distinction, or that distinction between problem solving and critical theory, some kind of explanation of what Cox was trying to argue. And I realise that's that's not necessarily an easy task in and of itself, but I think somewhere at the start you should have something on that. I also mentioned in the lecture that I think Paul Kamak's argument about RIP IPE, that's the title of the article, Rest in Peace IPE, is another kind of interesting response to Cox, many years after Cox, but where he challenges some of the kind of foundational assumptions, perhaps, of Cox's argument. Okay, and I would suggest that don't limit your reading to those two, and you don't have to use Kamak, but I would suggest that might be an interesting kind of way into that. And I think part of the question that you should be answering here is, does this problem solving versus critical theory distinction actually characterize the discipline of IPE for you? Does it work as a way of classifying or categorizing international theory more generally? And going back to those big overarching questions again, what's the consequence? What's the effect, the implication of that distinction, if we agree perhaps Cox is right or is on to something at least? Okay, that's question 1. Question 2, what is international political economy? I think somewhere in that essay you should be thinking about the questions of where did it come from? Where did IPE come from? And I said to you in the lecture a couple of days ago that you could use Cohen's argument there, for example, and his kind of genealogy of the discipline. But obviously that's not the only starting point. But you should be thinking about where did IPE come from? What does it do? What is it to try to do? Is it a discipline, for example? These kind of questions we've talked about in the lecture. Perhaps also, is it any good? Is it useful? Does it fulfill its purpose and its function? Okay, so that's question number 2. Question 3, a state market dichotomy still plagues contemporary IPE, limiting the scope and effectiveness of the discipline. Discuss. I think, as I said in the lecture, at some point in answering that question, you should have some kind of answer to the, what is state market dichotomy? Okay, and I pointed you to Jeffrey Underhill's definition, if you like. It's certainly not the only one. I also pointed you in the lectures, I think, to Kathleen McNamara, who talks about, if you like, politics having one particular logic over here and markets as having a kind of an opposing and distinct and separate logic. And but some way of kind of thinking about, does this state market dichotomy, does it actually, is it a valid caricature of the discipline? Does it, perhaps I suppose secondly then, does it prevent IPE from saying or doing something that we might expect or hope IPE to do? Okay, so that's question number 3. Question 4, discuss the relationship between IPE and international relations theory. I've had a couple of emails about this saying, do I have to have done a degree or a course in international relations theory before to be able to answer that question? My simple response is no, not at all. I pointed you in some of the lectures to Steve Smith and I think it's Ken Booth's book, International Relations Theory Today. There's other books by Smith, Booth, Roger Tooze and others during the 1990s where they ask, this kind of question, if you like, and it's part of the kind of the self-reflections within international relations theory during the 1990s. Okay, so in a nutshell, you don't have to have done an international relations theory module or degree before, but you need to be thinking about the claim, I suppose, that IP came out of IR, and how do you view that claim, I suppose, is part of the big question I'm asking there. Okay, that's question number 4. Question number 5 then, the global financial crisis is to IPE what the end of the Cold War was to IR. Discuss. If you want to answer this question, it might lend itself perhaps to someone who has studied international relations theory before. Perhaps slightly differently to question 4, though not necessarily. But I would think with question 5 that you would still need to go back to some of those kind of articles, chapters written during the 1990s, after the Cold War, whether that's even starting with Alexander Wenton. We talked about that article, Anarchy is What States Make of It, and have a look at the kind of the process of self-reflection, critical evaluation, if you like, going on in international relations theory during the 1990s, after the Cold War ended, and think about that kind of question. What happened to IR? Why did IR undergo this process of introspection and perhaps change during the 1990s? But I would say that 75–80% of the answer to question number 5 actually focuses very much on IP and focuses on the recent debates that have been taking place in Review of International Political Economy, New Political Economy, and a couple of edited volumes going along with that as well. So have a think about what's been happening in IPE more recently. And is that bringing about some kind of change? I'll leave that, maybe answering that question to you. That's question number 5. Question number 6. Which approach to the study of money and finance is most appropriate at the current historical conjuncture? Now, I would say that question 6 and question 7 are much more empirical questions. I've had emails from people, and I suppose that's part of the reason for putting this podcast together. If going through epistemology and ontology and methodology and the questions associated with those 3 kind of big broad themes, boggles you a little bit, then perhaps think about focusing on questions 6 and 7. As I said, it is one of the more empirical questions, But I think somewhere in there you need to think about the question of, how do you view the current conjuncture? How do you see the times that we're actually living through? What is happening? What is really happening in the world today? And how do you see it? And you could also think about then, I suppose, in relation to some of the lectures we'll have in a couple of weeks' time after study week, but you could also think about the questions, which of the different theories or perspectives captures the if you like, the kind of the positive aspect, not positive in a kind of a positive sense, but as in the way that the world really is. Are there particular theories that we have talked about by the time you watch this, perhaps, or the time you come to write your essay? Are there particular theories and approaches that best characterize the way that the world actually is, the way that finance actually works, what is happening in the world today? I suppose kind of the flip side to that is, what about the kind of normative dimension? Are there particular theories or approaches that we'll look at or have looked at that characterize the way that you would like the world to be, the way that the world ought to be, the way that finance ought to be done, if you like, if you want to put it in those terms? Okay, so that's question number 6. And as I said, question number 7 kind of follows on from that in a sense. It's another empirically based question. I would suggest that most of the readings for that are going to be second term readings. After Christmas, the brief history of neoliberalism, continuity and change in the UK and in Europe. I think those readings would be very useful starting points for answering that question. And you may say, well, isn't that a bit unfair? We haven't covered that in lectures yet. Sure, basically what I've tried to do with that is to give you a kind of way out. If, as I said, the theory-based questions, the more heavily theoretical, conceptual, abstract questions, are trickier for you, then perhaps think about question 6 or question 7. As I said, link it to what's going on next semester, where part of the argument with those continuity and change, brief history of neoliberalism seminars is this idea that it's more like a kind of case study, if you like, evidence showing the fact that very little has changed. And I think part of the underlying question behind number 7 is this idea of, is the world changing? And if so, how? Is it for the better? And what are the kind of the underlying mechanisms behind that? The symptoms, the signs, if you like, the ways of assessing that the world is changing, and perhaps think about linking that up to some of the stuff that we've talked about this term. So I hope that's been helpful. As I said, I'm not going to haven't given you my particular answer to any of these questions, but I do hope that what I've said will help you to think about the readings, make them more manageable, the questions you should be asking as you go through them. And as I said, if in any doubt about how to structure the essays, go back to the original podcast I did a couple of days ago.